Sit down. Sit down and eat.
In the golden era of Western films, two names stood out prominently: John Wayne and Lee Van Cleef. While both carved niches for themselves in the genre, their paths, though occasionally intersecting, were marked by an undercurrent of tension that many fans sensed but few understood. John Wayne, often referred to as the Duke, epitomized the American cowboy, brave, stoic, and unwavering in his principles. His on-screen persona was a reflection of the traditional Western hero, and he became a symbol of American values during a time of significant cultural shifts. Lee Van Cleef, on the other hand, brought a different energy to the screen. With his sharp features and piercing gaze, he often portrayed complex characters that blurred the lines between hero and villain. His roles in spaghetti westerns, especially under the direction of Sergio Leone, showcased a depth and nuance that contrasted with the more straightforward characters Wayne portrayed. Their first notable collaboration was in the 1962 film The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. While Wayne played the lead role of Tom Doniphan, Van Cleef had a smaller part as one of Liberty Valance's henchmen. Despite sharing the screen, their interactions were minimal, and reports from the set suggest that their relationship was strictly professional, lacking warmth or camaraderie. Behind the scenes, differences in their backgrounds and beliefs may have contributed to the distance between them. Wayne, who did not serve in the military during World War II, faced criticism for his absence from the front lines, especially when many of his contemporaries, including directors like John Ford, had served. Van Cleef, conversely, was a decorated Navy veteran, having served aboard a minesweeper during the war. This disparity in their wartime experiences might have been a silent point of contention, especially in an industry where authenticity was highly valued. Moreover, their differing approaches to acting and film choices further highlighted their contrasting personas. Wayne often stuck to traditional westerns that reinforced American ideals, while Van Cleef embraced the grittier, morally ambiguous world of spaghetti westerns. This divergence not only showcased their individual preferences, but also mirrored the evolving landscape of cinema during the 1960s and 70s. While there were no public feuds or overt displays of animosity between the two, the subtle tensions and differences in their careers and personal histories painted a picture of two men who, despite operating in the same genre, stood on opposite ends of the Western spectrum. In mid-century Hollywood, few rivalries simmered under the surface quite like that between John Wayne and Lee Van Cleef. Even though they weren't headlining the same films, the industry made its preferences known, and Lee Van Cleef felt it. While John Wayne was being groomed as the all-American hero, Van Cleef was consistently typecast as a villain, no matter how much more he had to offer. That kind of favor didn't go unnoticed, especially by someone as sharp and observant as Van Cleef. The reality was this: Hollywood had picked its cowboy. And it wasn't Lee. Wayne had the major studios behind him, directors like John Ford crafting roles around his towering presence, and publicists pushing his image into the American psyche. Meanwhile, Van Cleef, despite his commanding performances and undeniable charisma, was often relegated to supporting roles or left waiting years between meaningful parts. It's no wonder a quiet resentment began to grow. But there was more to this divide than just roles and recognition. According to industry insiders from the era, Van Cleef believed that Wayne actively contributed to blocking actors he didn't like or didn't trust from climbing the Hollywood ladder. Whether that was personal, political, or just professional, we may never know. But what's clear is that Van Cleef often found himself outside the inner circle, watching the same types of roles go to the same names, with Wayne's name often at the top of the list. And here's where things start to get more personal. Van Cleef was known to be meticulous, disciplined, and intensely dedicated to his craft. Unlike Wayne, who played a version of himself in nearly every film, Van Cleef molded himself to the character, whether it was a cold-blooded gunslinger or a reluctant antihero. He respected acting as a craft, not just a paycheck, and he reportedly looked down on actors who treated it like a vanity project. Wayne, for all his fame, didn't always take kindly to that kind of criticism. Privately, Van Cleef didn't hide his disdain. He believed that Hollywood's obsession with image over ability was killing the Western genre, and Wayne was its poster boy. To Van Cleef, this wasn't just about professional jealousy. It was about what the Western could have been versus what it became: formulaic, sanitized, and repetitive. Still, Van Cleef played the game, but on his terms. When he finally broke into leading roles through spaghetti westerns in Europe, far from the reach of Wayne's Hollywood, he flourished. No filters. No gatekeepers. and no one calling the shots but the directors who actually respected his talent. But that taste of international success only sharpened the sting of being overlooked at home. Hollywood had already made its choice, and Van Cleef never forgot it. And when the tables finally turned, what Van Cleef did next showed just how deep that bitterness ran. When Hollywood kept shutting its doors, Lee Van Cleef packed his bags and his rage and found salvation in the least expected place, Italy. The American Western may have ignored him, but European directors were paying attention. And one man in particular changed everything, Sergio Leone. After the success of A Fistful of Dollars with Clint Eastwood, Leone was looking for another face that could match that gritty, no-nonsense style. He saw something in Van Cleef that Hollywood didn't: danger, depth, and charisma. That's how Lee landed for a few dollars more, and later, the good, the bad, and the ugly. These roles didn't just revive his career, they redefined it. But Van Cleef's rise overseas wasn't just a professional win. It was a silent, seething victory over everything he resented about Hollywood, and perhaps even over John Wayne himself. Here he was headlining films with global impact, working with cutting-edge directors, and finally being recognized, not for his resemblance to the American ideal, but for his raw talent and intimidating screen presence. It was everything he felt he'd earned, and never been given. And what made it sweeter? Wayne's world was starting to rust. While John Wayne still commanded attention back home, his grip on the Western genre was beginning to weaken. Audiences were growing tired of the same old clean-cut cowboy. They wanted grit. They wanted it. They wanted something that felt real. Van Cleef had become the embodiment of that shift. Yet still, back in the States, he was barely acknowledged. In interviews, he avoided talking about Wayne directly. But those who knew him said the disdain was still there, just beneath the surface. He reportedly believed Wayne's control over the genre back home had stunted the careers of more daring actors and kept westerns from evolving until it was too late. Privately, Van Cleef saw the spaghetti western boom as proof that the American studios were out of touch, that Hollywood had clung too long to Wayne's formulaic hero, while Europe took creative risks that actually paid off. It was a quiet kind of revenge, the kind you don't brag about. You just let the box office speak for itself. But even as Van Cleef's fame surged in Europe, his bitterness didn't fade. Because no matter how high he climbed overseas, he knew the industry back home still viewed John Wayne as the king, and him as just a footnote. That silent grudge stayed with him, and it would only deepen when their paths nearly crossed again, this time in a way that could have rewritten both their careers. It was the late 1960s, and a surprising rumor started quietly circulating among Hollywood insiders. Lee Van Cleef was being considered for a major American production. Not just any role, but one that could have put him head-to-head with John Wayne on U.S. soil. After years of being a European cult hero, Van Cleef was inching toward a return. Finally, a chance to confront the very industry that had discarded him. The film? It was said to be a gritty Western ensemble project, something that leaned into the darker side of frontier justice. Producers were reportedly looking for a counterbalance to Wayne's larger-than-life presence. Someone equally intense but less polished. Van Cleef's name kept coming up. Not because he was fashionable in the US, but because European box office numbers were making noise, and the industry couldn't ignore it anymore. But the whispers didn't last long. According to some accounts, when John Wayne learned of the casting discussions, he made his disapproval known. Wayne had clout, real clout. He didn't just act in westerns, he defined them. And those close to the project say he wasn't about to share the screen with someone he viewed as insubordinate, dangerous, and most unforgivably, not part of his version of America. The deal quietly fell apart. Van Cleef never confirmed it publicly. Neither did Wayne. But those in the know say the message was clear. The door to Hollywood hadn't truly opened. Not for Lee. Not while John Wayne still held the keys. It wasn't just a lost role. It was a symbolic slap in the face. After all the acclaim in Europe, after helping reinvent an entire genre, Van Cleef was still considered too rough, too threatening to the American Western status quo. And the man blocking his return? The same cowboy icon who'd been riding tall while Van Cleef was scraping by as a character actor. Van Cleef's resentment deepened. He was never one to speak out or stir public drama, but those around him said the frustration lingered. That close brush with mainstream redemption was one of the last chances he had to reclaim what had been denied him for decades. Worse still, he knew what the role could have done, not just for his career, but for the image of westerns in America. It was an opportunity to show the world that the rugged anti-hero had a place alongside the traditional cowboy, that a Lee Van Cleef character could be just as American, just as powerful as a John Wayne one. But instead, that moment disappeared into Hollywood shadows, unofficial, unconfirmed, but deeply felt. It reinforced everything Van Cleef already believed about the industry and its chosen favorites. And as Van Cleef continued his work overseas, his bitterness hardened into something more permanent. Because even success in Europe couldn't erase what he saw as a deliberate erasure of his place in the story of American cinema. But fate still had one more twist waiting for both men. By the early 1970s, Lee Van Cleef had become a full-fledged icon in European cinema. Films like Day of Anger, Sabata, and The Big Gundown had made him a staple of the spaghetti western genre. He was a magnet for audiences across Italy, Spain, and even parts of Asia. Ironically, he had achieved the type of stardom John Wayne had always enjoyed in America, just not on Wayne's turf. But here's where the story takes a strange and painful turn. Despite his growing fame abroad, Van Cleef's name still carried little weight in Hollywood. Studio execs often acted like he'd vanished after the 50s, reducing him to a footnote while praising the same tired rotation of Western stars. And the one name that always sat at the top of that list? John Wayne. Wayne was now more powerful than ever. He had survived the cultural shifts of the 60s and remained the poster boy for American masculinity. While Van Cleef was riding horses through Spanish deserts, Wayne was collecting Oscars and shaping political conversations with his public persona. It was as if the more Van Cleef accomplished, the more he was ignored back home. And this cut deep. Van Cleef didn't chase fame for vanity. He wanted recognition, respect. Not as a sidekick or villain, but as a lead, a symbol of resilience, complexity, and strength. He'd earned it, yet Hollywood still viewed him through the lens of his early years, typecast, replaceable, expendable. Meanwhile, Wayne had the media in his pocket. His interviews were filled with patriotic monologues, and he rarely missed a chance to criticize what he saw as a decline in American values, often taking thinly veiled shots at more cynical, modern westerns, the very kind Van Cleef had helped popularize. To Wayne, the brooding anti-hero wasn't a hero at all. It was weakness disguised as grit. That philosophy, that hardline division between real men and pretenders, became a silent but steady dig at everything Van Cleef stood for. And yet, Van Cleef stayed quiet. He wasn't a public fighter. But insiders said he was acutely aware of every slight, every omission, every moment he was passed over or left out of the narrative. The man who had reinvented the Western archetype for a new generation was still being treated like a fringe character in a story he helped build. It's here that the true cost of bitterness began to show. Van Cleef may have been celebrated in Europe, but behind closed doors, those closest to him said he was frustrated, even haunted. Fame without validation is a hollow victory, and he knew it. His efforts weren't just overlooked. They were actively blocked by a system built to elevate men like Wayne and bury anyone who didn't fit the mold. But what happens when that mold finally cracks? What happens when the legend you resent starts to fall apart? John Wayne was more than just an actor. He was a brand, a political force, and to many, the embodiment of America itself. But in the 1970s, cracks began to show in the larger-than-life persona he carefully constructed. His outspoken conservatism was no longer the safe bet it had once been. A new generation of audiences were weary, rebellious, and skeptical of American exceptionalism, started to turn away from the kind of myth Wayne sold on screen. And that didn't sit well with him. As the Vietnam War dragged on and protests swelled across college campuses, Wayne doubled down. He condemned what he called the softness of America's youth. He rejected the anti-establishment tone of New Hollywood. And most controversially, he continued to promote a narrow, often exclusionary view of patriotism. A 1971 Playboy interview, where he made racially and politically inflammatory remarks, sparked massive backlash. Wayne, who once seemed untouchable, was now at the center of a cultural firestorm. Meanwhile, Lee Van Cleef watched from a distance. He wasn't exactly cheering for Wayne's downfall, but there was a kind of cold vindication in watching the man who had once dismissed him lose his grip on the spotlight. Hollywood was changing, and suddenly Van Cleef's gritty, flawed, morally complex characters didn't look so fringe anymore. They looked real. The spaghetti westerns he starred in were raw, unpredictable, and morally gray, everything Wayne's films avoided. And younger audiences were eating it up. Directors like Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez would later cite Van Cleef as a key influence in redefining what a Western could be. He wasn't the guy in the white hat saving the town. He was the guy in black, making you question who the real villain was. As Wayne aged and his box office clout declined, Van Cleef found his second wind. He returned to American cinema with newfound authority, albeit in lower-budget productions. While never given the blockbuster budgets Wayne once commanded, he finally had the respect of filmmakers who saw what the industry had long ignored. Van Cleef was more than a character actor. He was a force. There's irony in all this. For years, Wayne symbolized strength and control, the immovable mountain of American masculinity. But as public sentiment shifted, that mountain began to erode. Meanwhile, Van Cleef, once discarded and underestimated, became the symbol of adaptability, subtlety, and endurance. He never needed to shout. He let his work speak for itself. And maybe that's what stung the most for Wayne. Because in the final years of their careers, the lines between them blurred. Wayne's star dimmed, his relevance questioned. Van Cleef, though never a household name in the same way, earned a kind of underground legacy that outlasted the very system that tried to keep him in the background. But Van Cleef's story still had one final twist, and it involved the very legacy he tried to leave behind. By the late 1970s, Hollywood was experiencing a creative identity crisis. The golden age had faded, new Hollywood directors were pushing boundaries, and aging stars like John Wayne were looking for ways to stay relevant. Lee Van Cleef, too, was back in the U.S., having made his mark overseas but never quite earning the same stature in American productions. Then something unexpected happened. A Western project circulated quietly through the industry, gritty, revisionist, and reportedly meant to pair two aging icons for one last ride. Rumors swirled that producers were eyeing both Wayne and Van Cleef to co-star. The script had all the hallmarks of a passing-the-torch narrative, two old gunslingers from different worlds, forced to face their pasts and each other. It was the kind of story that could have healed old wounds or ripped them open for good. Insiders claimed Wayne initially showed interest. Perhaps he saw it as a way to reassert his dominance in a changing cinematic landscape. But Van Cleef, when approached, was reportedly skeptical. He wasn't the type to jump at any offer, especially one that risked putting him in Wayne's shadow again. And by now, he carved out his own lane, darker, more European, less beholden to the sanitized vision of the Old West that Wayne had long championed. The deal quietly fell apart. Some say Wayne backed out once he realized Van Cleef would be his equal, not a villain, not a supporting act, but a co-lead. Others suggest Van Cleef didn't want to reopen old tensions. He didn't need Wayne's approval anymore. He built his own legend, brick by brick, far from the Hollywood machine that once cast him aside. Still, the near collaboration lingered in industry circles like a ghost of what could have been. Fans speculated endlessly about how the two icons might have played off each other, especially in a story that asked hard questions about morality, violence, and legacy, themes both actors had come to embody in their own ways. But it wasn't just missed opportunity that haunted the story. It was timing. Wayne's health was deteriorating. Years of battling cancer and injuries had taken their toll. Van Cleef, too, had suffered major injuries in a car crash earlier in life, and while he worked through pain, the physicality of his roles was growing harder to maintain. The window for that legendary face-off was closing, and beneath the surface, there may have been something deeper than rivalry, mutual recognition. Wayne had built his myth on power and control, Van Cleef on survival and grit. In many ways, they were two sides of the same coin, but time had robbed them of the chance to show that on screen. Still, Van Cleef's story wasn't done yet. There was one more chapter, one that would reveal the price of defiance and the toll of a career built in the shadows of giants. Lee Van Cleef had always been a rebel in the most subtle and enduring way. He didn't make loud demands, didn't play the Hollywood publicity game, and certainly didn't pander to the system that once shoved him aside. But that quiet rebellion came with a cost, one that began to show more clearly as the years rolled on. Unlike John Wayne, whose face was practically stamped on Mount Rushmore in the American film industry, Van Cleef didn't have the luxury of legacy deals, lifetime studio contracts, or the favor of big-time producers. After his European spaghetti western successes, he returned to Hollywood thinking the door might be open, but it was only cracked. His name, though revered by die-hard fans, still didn't carry the same weight among the old American guard. It wasn't just about money, though that too became a growing concern. Van Cleef's European paychecks had looked good at the time, but they didn't come with the residuals, royalties, or long-term protections that Wayne's studio-backed deals did. And unlike Wayne, Van Cleef wasn't the face of national campaigns or granted luxurious cameo roles in retirement. He worked because he had to. Worse, health problems began to catch up with him. That old car crash injury from years before had done lasting damage to his knees and back, and the action-heavy roles that had once made him iconic were now punishing to perform. Still, he powered through, never one to complain publicly. But friends noticed. The limp was more pronounced. His energy, more reserved. The man who once stood tall without a word now bore the quiet weight of a career spent pushing against the tide. Opportunities, once steady, started to dry up. Hollywood was moving on. The gritty westerns were gone. New faces, younger stars, and entirely different genres now ruled the screen. For Van Cleef, there were fewer scripts, fewer calls, and fewer friends. Many of the people he had once known, including Wayne, had either passed or faded from relevance. He had chosen the hard road, and now, at the end of it, he was alone. And yet, there was something dignified in the way he handled it all. No tell-all interviews. No public bitterness. He rarely mentioned John Wayne again, and when he did, it was never with venom. Only the flat honesty of a man who had made peace with the system, even if it never made peace with him. But even those closest to him said you could see it, the toll. Not just physically, but emotionally. The feeling of having given so much, defied the odds, built a second career from the ashes of rejection, and still being somewhat invisible in your own country. Lee Van Cleef's rebellion made him a legend, but it also made him expendable in the eyes of Hollywood. And as the spotlight dimmed, it became clear, legends don't always get their due while they're alive. But one more twist remained, one that no one saw coming. Just when it seemed like Lee Van Cleef's story would quietly fade into the background of Hollywood history, something unexpected happened. Long after his prime, after the major roles had dried up and the industry had largely moved on, a strange and powerful wave began to form. One that Van Cleef himself didn't live long enough to fully witness. A legacy revival. It started slowly, with cult film festivals screening Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to packed houses in college towns and European cities. Critics who had once brushed off spaghetti westerns now call them revisionist masterpieces. And in nearly every write-up, one name stood out: Lee Van Cleef. Suddenly, the stoic gunslinger with a hawk-like gaze was being rediscovered. Not as a sidekick, not as a supporting villain, but as a force of charisma who had played against the grain in every role. Younger directors cited him as an influence. Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, and even Clint Eastwood would all acknowledge Van Cleef's quiet brilliance. He wasn't just part of the genre. He was the soul of a certain kind of Western grit. Streaming platforms picked up his old films. Fan pages exploded with tribute videos, rare interviews, and behind-the-scenes stills. His scenes were clipped, remixed, and celebrated across digital platforms he never lived to see. For a man who never craved fame in the traditional sense, his posthumous rise was poetic justice, a slow-burning spotlight that finally found him. And while John Wayne remained the all-American symbol of the traditional Western, Lee Van Cleef became something else entirely, the outsider hero. The man who never quite fit in, who stood in the shadows and made silence dangerous. Fans didn't just admire him, they related to him. The irony? Hollywood started making Van Cleef-style characters again, not Wayne's square-jawed patriots, but morally gray anti-heroes, reluctant loners, complex men with past that haunted them. It was as if Lee Van Cleef's ghost had reshaped the genre from beneath the surface. Film historians began asking the questions that weren't raised when he was alive. Why didn't Van Cleef get more recognition? Why was he blackballed early on? What role did his feud with John Wayne really play in his American career drying up? And in that reflection, something shifted. Van Cleef's story was no longer just about missed chances and lingering grudges. It became a lesson in resilience, about holding your ground, even when the system doesn't reward you. He never publicly lashed out, never begged for attention. He just kept working, kept showing up, and left behind a legacy that, in the end, refused to be ignored. But the story wasn't fully complete, not until one final chapter brought everything full circle. By the time the dust settled on the careers of both Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne, the truth was undeniable. One had been crowned Hollywood royalty, while the other had become a symbol of underappreciated brilliance. But in the final reckoning, the mythos surrounding each man shifted in surprising ways. And in that shift, Lee Van Cleef may have had the last word, without ever needing to speak it. John Wayne died in 1979, celebrated, idolized, and awarded with every honor imaginable. His funeral was a national event. Flags were flown at half-mast, tributes poured in from politicians and movie stars, and his legacy was etched in stone. But in the decades that followed, the once unquestioned icon began to face a more complicated reckoning. Old interviews resurfaced. Controversial opinions he'd voiced, once brushed off, were now re-evaluated under a modern lens. Debates ignited about the man behind a cowboy hat, and suddenly, Wayne's legacy didn't feel quite as bulletproof as it once did. Lee Van Cleef, on the other hand, passed away in 1989 with far less fanfare. There were no national tributes, no political statements, no grand retrospectives. He died quietly, almost poetically, just as he had lived in the shadow of the industry's glare. And yet, with each passing year, his name grew louder, not through marketing or nostalgia-driven PR, but through genuine admiration from generations of fans and filmmakers alike. That's the twist no one saw coming. In a culture obsessed with image, Van Cleef's legacy endured because of substance. Because behind every squint, every drawl, every calculated move on screen was an actor who gave everything to the role and demanded nothing in return. He didn't need to grandstand or play the hero in real life. He let the work speak for itself, and decades later, it still speaks. As for his alleged hatred of John Wayne, it was never confirmed. Van Cleef never publicly criticized Wayne, never gave interviews throwing shade. But the whispers persisted about creative clashes, about ideological divides, about Van Cleef's disdain for Wayne's dominance and the arrogance that sometimes came with it. Whether the grudge was personal or professional, one thing was clear: Van Cleef never played by Hollywood's rules, and that alone may have put him at odds with the Duke in his circle. In the end, the contrast between the two men became their legacy. John Wayne, the mainstream legend, loved and scrutinized in equal measure. Lee Van Cleef, the outsider who never sought the crown, but whose influence quietly rewrote the rules of what a Western hero could be. The industry may not have given Van Cleef his due while he was alive, but his revenge, if he ever wanted one, came posthumously through cult status, critical reevaluation, and a permanent place in the hearts of movie lovers who saw something in his eyes that no award could capture. Sometimes, the man who dies in silence ends up speaking loudest of all.